We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
Hollywood ruins everything. We all know that, right? The Hollywood movie machine takes source materials, often novels, and excises their heart and soul, leaving only hollowed-out husks, mangles them into pandering mockeries of their literary sources, strips the meat off their bones, and slaps a gauzy veneer onto the ambulating skeleton. You get the idea. Hollywood films are intended for mass consumption. There's no getting around this. So when Hollywood producers get their hands on a piece of literature, it's no surprise that they might focus on exciting set pieces, lurid plot developments, and the appealing or scandalous aspects of the characters, often at the expense of the story's subtler qualities. They might ignore or even eliminate any confusing contradictions in the situation and the characters, simplify the story, and make the people who populate that story more camera-ready, both inside and out. Read the first chapter of Stephen King's Carrie, for instance, and you'll immediately perceive something funny about the casting of Sissy Spacek and later Chloe Grace Moretz in the lead role. The idea that Hollywood dumbs down literature is so pervasive it's become a cliché. Many of us have probably had the experience of telling a friend we enjoyed a movie we just saw and having them respond, perhaps with a condescending sigh, "Yeah, it was all right, but the book was better." Now, this reputation is partly earned and partly overstated. Sometimes, given the right circumstances and the perfect creative team, a film adaptation can actually make critical improvements to a book, cracking open the story's themes and identifying something it needs that the author might have missed. Chuck Palahniuk, the author of Fight Club, acknowledged that the ending of David Fincher's film adaptation works better than the ending of the book. I would have to agree. While the novel has its virtues, its ending is a bit soft, resorting to a hackneyed psychological thriller trope that all but invalidates the second half of the plot. The ending of the film, though perhaps a bit overblown, both literally and figuratively, plays to the scale of the serio-comic operatic drama they'd crafted, rather than collapsing in upon itself. Rather than rendering the story toothless, as so many adaptations do, the film gives Fight Club a fresh set of canines. Admittedly, though, this kind of improvement is rare. Which invites the question, why do so many films fall short of the novels they're based on? Now, the simplest answer is that it's really hard to cram 200 or 300 pages of prose into a 2-hour movie. It's just too much material. This may be why some of the best cinematic adaptations, or my favorites anyway, movies like Memento, A River Runs Through It, and Brokeback Mountain, are based on short stories. Stephen King's quartet of non-horror novellas, Different Seasons, yielded 3 successful film adaptations: The Shawshank Redemption, Apt Pupil, and Stand By Me, all of which either live up to or elevate the 100-page stories they're based on. Director Todd Williams wisely opted to adapt only the first part of the John Irving novel A Widow for 1 Year when he made the underappreciated 2004 film The Door and the Floor. Sometimes a film adaptation goes poorly because of a miscalculation about what aspects of the story to focus on, or plain old poor execution in the making of the film, problems that can occur in any movie, adapted or original. The fact is, movies are really, really hard to make, and even harder to make well. But what I think discerning audiences find really annoying is when they get the impression that the filmmakers have cheapened or sugar-coated the story to make it more appealing to a broad audience, and hence, of course, to sell more tickets. When they get the impression that the story hasn't been adapted in good faith, that it's been commodified, declawed, neutered, or perhaps more heinously, sexed up. This impression that the filmmakers may not be dealing with the material in good faith is a charge that's sometimes leveled at the otherwise lauded film adaptation of Breakfast at Tiffany's. Apart from Mickey Rooney's cringe-worthy yellow-faced performance as Holly Golightly's Japanese landlord,
Mr. Golightly, someday, Mr. Golightly.
The movie invites criticism for flattening the free-spirited Holly by cramming her into a romantic arc with the narrator, an indignity that Truman Capote's creation never would have suffered. What are we to think, though, when a film distorts the intention of its source so willfully, so perversely, and with such a clear ideological bent that it flips the story's whole worldview on its head? What happens when an adaptation not only cheapens the source material, but actually corrupts its message? I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. Each episode, I take a look at a different topic in the arts, examining how it both reflects and shapes our perceptions of the world. In the last episode, guest contributor Eric Poulin gave us a thorough account of how the 1988 film Die Hard distorted the difficult vision of its source material, chiefly by converting its damaged and dangerous protagonist, Joseph Leland, into the reluctant but ultimately noble hero, John McClane. Joseph Leland wasn't the only gritty mid-20th century action hero to be transformed into something more palatable under the shimmery, patriotic floodlights of Reagan-era Hollywood. Toward the end of the 20th century, the name Rambo was practically synonymous with American military might. It became a vehicle for valorizing the macho soldier who carries out the United States' increasingly interventionist military operations. The character, who appeared in 3 feature films between 1982 and 1988, also made Sylvester Stallone a household name. Okay, the Rocky movies didn't hurt. By the climax of 1988's Rambo 3, the character represented both American military might as a necessary, if uncomfortable, force of change in the world, and the mythos of the rugged individual, the army of one who, through his inestimable courage in combating the forces of evil, achieves a superhuman stature. But the Rambo we came to know, the seemingly invincible shirtless warrior with an even sheen of sweat coating his rubbery skin and that inscrutable bandana holding his hair out of his eyes, didn't come to us fully formed. The John Rambo we meet in 1982's First Blood, the first film in the series, is an emotionally wounded, morally conflicted veteran who engages in violence not as a glorious pursuit, but as a consequence of the traumas he incurred while serving in the Vietnam War. It is a study in the domestic fallout from war, specifically the difficulty that traumatized soldiers often face in readjusting to civilian life. Still, even in this first installment, the character received a questionable Hollywood makeover when the story was adapted from a novel of the same name by David Morrell. And it's worth looking into what this touch-up did to the story's intended effect, as well as what the conversion might suggest about the broader culture that invited, nay, demanded, that these adjustments be made before the story could be offered up to a mainstream movie-going audience. Published in 1972, First Blood is a brief and brutal novel, one of unrelenting and unflinching violence, relating a nightmarish encounter from which no one involved is spared. As Morrell explains in the introduction to the 20th anniversary edition of the book, he wanted to write a story in which the guerrilla carnage of the Vietnam War is brought home to America. His chosen agent of destruction is a young Green Beret and former POW, John Rambo. A Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, Rambo wishes only to be left alone, and this is exactly what he tries to achieve for several months following his return to America. Instead, he encounters hostility at every turn, which he manages to endure until he comes into the crosshairs of a small-town police chief, Wilfred Teasle. Himself a decorated veteran of the Korean War, Teasle is initially unimpressed by Rambo, a 20-something whippersnapper with shaggy hair and a scraggly beard. Teasle passes him off as an unkempt hippie who has somehow wandered into his rural Kentucky town. Pissed off that the kid repeatedly refuses to skedaddle, Teasle arrests him. When his deputy's attempts to shave Rambo and cut his hair remind the veteran a little too much of torture he suffered as a prisoner in Vietnam, he fights them off and flees into the wilderness outside of town, where he stages a solitary campaign against the local law enforcement and the state police. Broadly speaking, the film conforms to the narrative of the novel. The main plot points remain intact, and the cinematic John Rambo harbors many of the same demons as his literary counterpart. Still, there are critical differences that make the film go down a little easier than the book. The filmmakers were eager to add a hefty spoonful of sugar to First Blood's strong medicine. To begin with, there's the sheer body count. Sylvester Stallone, who not only stars in the film but co-wrote the screenplay, gives us a much less violent version of the character than we find in the novel. Stallone's Rambo kills only 2 people in the course of the film, one of them accidentally, while David Morrell's more cold-blooded version of the character takes out over a dozen police officers in his brutal campaign, plus one civilian, a man who is a father figure to Chief Teasel, and a handful of very loyal hounds. Stallone's Rambo only exerts lethal force when he is pushed into a corner and has no other options. Morrell's Rambo kills willfully, almost gleefully, and often unnecessarily. He seems eager to kill, sometimes in rather garish and gruesome ways. Though his plan is ostensibly to evade the authorities and flee to Mexico, his short-term objective is clearly to inflict as much damage as possible on his pursuers. More important, however, than the amount of violence is its motivation. Rambo's reason for going to war with the police undergoes an insidious shift from the novel to the film. To begin with, the literary Rambo deliberately and persistently provokes his antagonist Teasel, returning to his town repeatedly after being escorted away. He is just waiting for Teasel and his men to push him over the edge, almost baiting them to give him an excuse to attack. Granted, Teasel is out of line and driving Rambo out of town without cause, mistaken or not in his assessment that the kid is a vagrant, but there's no question that Rambo is looking for trouble. His own inner monologue reveals that he's asking for it. In 15 goddamn towns this has happened to me, Rambo tells himself. This is the last. I won't be fucking shoved anymore. Though Teasel acts inappropriately, he and his town end up on the receiving end of Rambo's ferocious guerrilla campaign, not only as retribution for their own actions, but by the sheer bad luck of being the straw that breaks the tormented soldier's back. By contrast, Stallone's Rambo returns to the town only once after being driven out, at which point the police chief sees fit to bring him into the station. Teasel, played with flinty relish by Brian Dennehy, is unquestionably the aggressor. All this, however, is mostly a matter of the action being compressed for the film, a common trait of cinematic adaptations. It's hard to cram all the plot points from a novel into a 2-hour movie. Plot-wise, the first consequential change occurs at the police station, when Teasel's men are attempting to shave Rambo and cut his shaggy hair. In both the novel and the film, the encounter triggers flashbacks of torture he suffered as a prisoner of war. In the book, however, while the officers taunt Rambo, they don't descend to the level of physical abuse. Yet Rambo responds to their assault on his person by wresting the straight razor away from one of the officers and summarily eviscerating him with it. He then runs naked out of the police station as the officer dies, his guts spilling out of his belly. In spite of Rambo's psychological trauma, this murder is clearly incommensurate with the officer's provocation. By contrast, in the film, one of the officers chokes Rambo with a billy club as another officer, eyes glinting with malice, approaches with the razor. Rambo, clothed in this version, mind you, responds by fighting off the officers with his fists and feet in a frankly somewhat lame fight sequence. Tellingly, the police chief Teasel is not present for the encounter in the film version. Put a pin in that point. I'll return to it in a bit. So, on the one hand, we have a tortured soldier who responds to a perceived threat, not even a threat to his physical safety, mind you, but to his dignity and comfort, by viciously murdering a police officer. On the other hand, we have a tortured soldier who responds to an actual physical assault with a comparatively restrained counterattack. Short of using Aikido throws or the Jedi mind trick to subdue his attackers, Stallone's Rambo could hardly manage to do less harm in his escape. He throws a punch or two and breaks a couple of windows. That's about it. Later, During the long hunt sequence in the forest that is the centerpiece of the action, Stallone's Rambo deliberately spares the lives of multiple officers, a show of restraint that would have been unthinkable to the main character of the novel. But again, it's not so much the amount of harm the character does as it is the justification for his actions. The novel presents Rambo's actions without justification. In fact, the author persistently reinforces the notion that Rambo's actions are not supported by anything other than the cold, inhuman logic of war. Rambo himself acknowledges as much in his inner monologue, or inner dialogue, I ought to say, the more civilized part of him unsuccessfully cross-examining the killing machine that has taken over the command center of his brain. The author tells us early on that it's too late to stop his mind from completing the circle. Once again, he returned to the war. Toward the end of the book, the military officer who oversaw Rambo's training, Colonel Sam Troutman, enters the scene to aid the police. He delivers this message to Rambo over the radio. "Rambo, listen to me. I know you can hear me. I want you to stop and surrender before they kill you. I'm helping them because I don't want you killed. If I thought there was the slightest chance of you beating them, I'd gladly tell you to keep on the move. But I know you can't get away. Believe me, I know it. Please, while you still can, get up and get out of this alive. There's nothing you can do." Hearing this, Rambo says to himself, "Watch me." Compare this terse response to Stallone's almost teary-eyed plea in the equivalent scene from the film.
Seems like bailing you out of trouble's getting to be a lifetime job for me.
There wouldn't be no trouble except for that king shit cup. All I wanted was something to eat. But the man kept pushing, sir.
Well, you did some pushing of your own, John.
They drew first blood, not me.
Look, Johnny. Let me come in and get you the hell out of there.
They drew first blood.
The phrase first blood is never even used in the text of the book, leaving the title deliberately ambiguous. David Morrell explains that when he conceived of the book, he wanted the reader to identify with each character and at the same time feel ambivalent about them. Who was the hero, who the villain? Or were both men heroes, both men villains? In the movie, the titular phrase is forcefully and unambiguously interpreted for the viewer. The police are the aggressors, and Rambo, even if he goes too far in his response, is essentially in the right. You see, the filmmakers were operating under a different set of imperatives, both artistic and ethical, than the novelist. It was supremely important to them that Rambo's actions, while painful to watch, are not only comprehensible, but justifiable. If Rambo is to be marketable, he needs to be the unequivocal hero of the story, not just its protagonist. If he is to be the hero, the audience must not only identify with him, the audience must like the character and approve of his actions. Interestingly, perhaps loath to vilify a small-town police chief, the filmmakers extend a similar courtesy to his antagonist, Teasel. While Dennehy's performance is appropriately unyielding and stern, the film outsources the worst of his actions to his subordinates. As I mentioned before, Teasel is not present when the deputies torment Rambo at the police station, prompting him to run away. In the novel, not only is Teasel present for the assault, he then leads the charge into the woods, insisting that they not wait for daybreak lest the state police intervene and take the mission out of their hands. And there's no mistaking that for Teasel, this is a mission. The most perverse character transformation, however, occurs to the supporting character of Art Galt, the officer who, in the book, Rambo disembowels in the police station. In the movie, Galt is transmuted into a sadistic instigator, defying the chief's orders by attempting lethal force on Rambo. He gets his comeuppance when he falls to his death after Rambo throws a stone at the police helicopter Galt is riding in. Galt, you see, has stumbled into a narrative universe in which the good guy, Rambo, only kills when provoked, and then only accidentally, and the bad guy, Galt, is necessarily punished for his misdeeds. Granted, he dies in either case, but in the book, his unheralded demise at least elicits a little bit of sympathy from the reader. The action of the novel is driven to such wild extremes because Rambo and Teasel are both willing, even eager, to escalate the situation. Morell explains, "The final confrontation between Rambo and Teasel would show that in the microcosmic version of the Vietnam War and American attitudes about it, escalating force results in disaster. The action of the movie, on the other hand, proceeds in spite of both men's attempts to de-escalate, an effort made difficult again by the treachery of the supporting cast. Stallone's Rambo even tries to put a stop to the violence early on, explaining unsuccessfully to the police that Galt's death was an accident. He didn't mean it." The filmmakers give us a film that exists in a moral universe with clear boundaries between good and evil, the only ambiguity being that there may be a good guy on both sides. The opposition between the two main characters gets out of hand because of the rash actions of a few bad actors, not because of systemic problems. That doesn't sound familiar at all now, does it? This insistence on giving the audience a moral landscape that is easy to navigate has deep roots in Hollywood, reaching back over half a century prior to the release of First Blood. It goes back at least to the adoption of the Hollywood Production Code in 1930. Also known as the Hays Code, the Production Code was a set of standards designed to maintain social and community values in the production of silent, synchronized, and talking motion pictures. The code was willingly adopted by the Hollywood studios and enforced through the mid-1950s. Devised as a method of self-regulation that would allow the studios to avoid scrutiny from the government, scrutiny that might in turn shed light on their shady business practices, the code expressly forbid a wide range of behaviors on screen. For instance, the exact methods used to commit crimes must never be presented lest they inspire imitation. Illegal drug traffic must never be presented, and the consumption of alcohol must only be shown insofar as it is essential to the plot or to characterization. Obscenity and vulgarity, broadly defined, are off limits, as are a number of sexually inappropriate images, including sex perversion, seduction or rape, scenes of actual childbirth, and miscegenation. White slavery, which must never be treated, is also rather confusingly categorized under sex. However, the production code didn't stop at enumerating specific deeds that could not be depicted on screen. It went so far as to dictate in what narrative light various misdeeds ought to be framed. It is not just the actions themselves, but the motivation for the actions that is important. We must never sympathize with an immoral character. By the same token, any character we are encouraged to sympathize with must behave in a consistently ethical fashion. For instance, the plot of Daphne du Maurier's 1938 novel Rebecca hinges on a murder committed in the past by one of the main characters. In order to comply with the Hays Code, Alfred Hitchcock's 1940 film adaptation made the killing accidental. It would have been far too unseemly by Hollywood standards for a character with whom we identify to have gotten away with murder. In case it weren't obvious, there is a religious underpinning to all this that we don't usually associate with Hollywood today. As Thomas Doherty, a professor at Brandeis University, points out, the Hays Code was no mere list of thou shalt nots, but a homily that sought to yoke Catholic doctrine to Hollywood formula. The guilty are punished, the virtuous rewarded, the authority of church and state is legitimate, and the bonds of matrimony are sacred. The Hays Code was largely a collusion between Hollywood studio heads and leaders within the Catholic Church, who were often invited to approve material before it was distributed. It was an ironic bit of symbiosis, but effective enough while it lasted. Given the sanction of the Church, the studio heads got to keep the government out of their hair, while the Church got to use this groundbreaking popular medium to promote traditional values. Although the production code was abandoned in the 1950s, eventually being replaced by the voluntary rating system that's still in place today, its spirit never entirely left. Even as standards of content became far more permissive and the explicit depiction of sex, violence, and strong language became pervasive in the late 20th century, the default sorting of characters into white hats and black hats remained entrenched in popular filmmaking. While the 1970s, with its slew of anti-heroes and nauseating takes on war and political corruption, signaled a temporary retreat from this dualistic worldview, the essence of the philosophy expressed in the Hays Code came roaring back in the 1980s. Only this time, it was sporting some heavy artillery. Where the Hays Code sought to yoke Catholic doctrine to Hollywood formula, the new unofficial code sought to yoke American political doctrine to Hollywood formula. Like Nothing Lasts Forever, the novel that eventually became Die Hard, First Blood languished in Hollywood for over a decade before a clever producer figured out what to do with it, converting it from a gruesome tale of the insanity of war into one that was marketable because, while it remains difficult to behold, it ultimately sanctions American values, or at least the story we tell ourselves about our values. We don't hurt them until they've hurt us. That's the narrative the film is peddling, one that is anathema to the message of the book. Now, I want to give the filmmakers some credit here. In a number of ways, the movie improves upon the novel. The story is less blunt, more nuanced. The novel is a bit indulgent with the violence, giving over to shock value at times. The film puts Rambo in the forest with only a hunting knife, forcing him to show his mettle by laying booby traps for his hunters. This is an ingenious move that heightens the tension of the action sequences. The filmmakers also made the smart choice to have the action take place 7 years after Rambo's return from Vietnam, rather than a few months after he was discharged. He enters Teasel's town after visiting his buddy from Vietnam, who is now dying from complications of the chemicals he was exposed to in the war. This backdrop adds some depth and resonance to the character's journey. The audience sees from the first scene that he is the last surviving member of his unit, and that years later, he's still unable to adjust to civilian life. That's a stirring emotional premise. The film version of First Blood also personalizes the relationship between Rambo and Colonel Troutman, making it an almost paternal arrangement. It's not surprising that Sylvester Stallone had a hand in developing these added elements. Stallone knows how to play on his audience's emotions. Even the less, shall we say, prestige-oriented of the Rocky films never fail to deliver an emotional KO. The only emotions evoked by First Blood, the novel, are outrage, excitement, and fear. Now, if the filmmakers had left it at that, if they had made a more emotional and entertaining, if less problematic, film adaptation of a pretty good action novel and not taking it any further, I probably wouldn't be bothering to comment on it. But, as we all know, they didn't leave it at that. There have been 3 more movies in the series, beginning with the awkwardly titled Rambo First Blood Part 2 in 1985, then Rambo 3 in 1988, and a much later edition simply titled Rambo in 2008. The second and third installments ratchet up the violence to staggering extremes, even as the character is transformed from a damaged Vietnam vet terrorizing a rural town into a full-fledged action hero, one whose motives and actions may not be impugned because he is fighting for America. And this conversion had real-world consequences. Ronald Reagan said that, after watching one of the Rambo movies, he felt he would know what to do the next time they had a hostage situation. That's rather frightening, because the filmmaker's aim was clearly not to reflect how complex political and military decisions are made, or ought to be made in the real world, and certainly not to educate the president on how to act. Their responsibility, as they saw it, was to entertain the audience. Full stop. While David Morrell had literary, even philosophical aspirations in writing his novel, to the extent that the film's producers had an objective beyond pure entertainment, it was, as author Steve Berry writes in an essay on First Blood, to aid an emasculated America to feel good about itself again. David Morrell's novel was an attempt to take stock of the domestic consequences of the overseas atrocities perpetrated by the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. Hollywood's Rambo, in the 1985 and 1988 sequels at least, was an attempt to absolve the nation of its shame and horror at those very atrocities. Indeed, were it not for the film, there would have been no sequels to the novel, which ends with Rambo being unceremoniously executed by Colonel Troutman, the military officer who oversaw his training. He is killed by his creator. Yet the author agreed to write novelizations of Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Rambo 3 after the movie's releases. His stated reason is that he wanted to at least lend some insight into the character's internal life as this alternate narrative played out. Forgive me for sounding cynical, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were also more than a few dollar signs attached to Morel's decision. Mind you, I don't condemn Morel's decision to write these novelizations. Rambo is his creation, albeit one he tried to kill off, and far be it from me to begrudge a fellow artist profiting from the franchise's continued success. Still, there's no getting around the fact that his choice to write those sequels was a capitulation to the changes the filmmakers made to the character, which countenances, if not outright defends, the moral and artistic obscenity that became of Rambo. And it gets worse. In 1986, midway between the release of the second and third Rambo films, this new American hero found his way to the small screen as well, in the form of an animated series, Rambo, The Force of Freedom.
Rambo! Everywhere, the savage forces of General Warhawk threaten the peace-loving people of the world. There's only one man to call. Get me Rambo. From the canyons of skyscrapers to the canyons of remote mountain peaks, Liberty's champion is unstoppable. Rambo, helped by the mechanical genius known as Turbo, of disguises named Cat, the honor-bound protector of the innocent. Rambo, the force of freedom.
At the recommendation of child psychologists hired by the production company, all references to the Vietnam War and the characters having been a POW were expurgated from the story. It was scrubbed clean. The whole 65-episode series plays like an extended, unironic cut of the song America Fuck Yeah from Trey Parker and Matt Stone's satirical film Team America World Police. Incidentally, right out of the You Can't Make This Stuff Up bin, one episode of the animated series features an old friend of Rambo's who becomes a traitor, aiding and abetting the leader of the evil Savage organization. The character's name? Mike Flynn. Rambo's resonance may have fizzled out somewhat in the new century, reignited only briefly for the fourth installment in the series. Sylvester Stallone has denied rumors that there's a fifth film in the works. But just when we might have thought the character had disappeared as a cultural and political touchstone, in early 2017, the Army introduced a 3D printed grenade launcher, an efficient, cost-effective instrument of close-range combat. Depending on your political leanings, it is either awesome or terrifying. The Army is calling it a Rapid Additively Manufactured Ballistics Ordnance, or Rambo. Now, I focused so far on the moral implications of the character's evolution through the films, but there's also an epistemological dimension to it. That is, it says something about our relationship to knowledge and facts. The development of Rambo through the first three films reflects something strange about the way we perceive things in our postmodern world. And put a pin in that term, I'll explain it in a bit. We might call this the Rambo effect. The Rambo effect is more or less the inverse of the better-known Rashomon effect. The Rashomon effect derives its name from Akira Kurosawa's 1950 film Rashomon, in which four witnesses to a crime give differing, even contradictory accounts of the same event. As Professor Robert Anderson explains in his essay, The Rashomon Effect and Communication, the Rashomon effect arises from the presence of differing perspectives combined with an inability to disqualify any particular version of the truth, all surrounded by the social pressure for closure on the question. A corollary to the Rashomon effect is that as more information is introduced, that is, as the narrative develops and becomes more complex, the observer becomes less and less confident about the definitive truth of the matter. The thing is, From an artistic perspective, while the Rashomon effect is stirring when applied to a relatively brief, contained story, it's difficult to sustain over a longer narrative. See, for instance, the Showtime series The Affair, which tells a rather convoluted story of desire and betrayal through 2 and later 4 contrasting perspectives. After 2 seasons of the show, my mind was no longer able to support all the conflicting accounts, and I found my memory of the events coalescing around a single coherent version of the narrative. This is what our minds like to do, which is what makes the Rashomon effect so captivating in small doses, as it creates dramatic tension by disorienting us and frustrating our desire for clarity, but also so unworkable over a longer arc. The Rambo movies tacitly acknowledge the ultimate unsustainability of the Rashomon effect, giving us a portrayal of the character that becomes more definitive, less ambiguous over time. This is what I'm calling the Rambo effect. The belief, reflected in the narrative conceit of the Rambo franchise, that our knowledge of an event, person, or situation becomes more clear as information is added. This is, of course, largely a fiction, a comfortable illusion that appeals to our fretful desire for clarity, our deep desire to believe that we see things the way they really are, not only in the realm of facts, but of ethics. The Rambo movies tell us that we don't need to question our beliefs and our values, and the more we find out pursuant to the question, the less we need to question things. The more we learn, the more our certainty will increase, regardless of whether the new information actually agrees with what we believe to be true. For many Americans today, however, the Rambo effect is more than a mere delusion, a tacit belief in a wrong-headed way of thinking. For perhaps a plurality of 21st century Americans, it rises to the level of a conviction, an article of faith, and even a point of pride. In 2006, Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler coined the term the backfire effect, describing a version of confirmation bias by which one becomes more entrenched in one's beliefs and opinions when presented with evidence that challenges those views. We all fall prey to this, and researchers at USC's Creativity and Brain Institute have begun to identify the neural pathways at work in the backfire effect. The Rambo effect, in one respect, is the result of the sustained application of the backfire effect. It's what happens when its consequences get inscribed into a person's worldview. But on another level, it constitutes either a refusal to believe in the backfire effect, that doesn't apply to me, or ironically, a spirited embrace of it. Sure, it applies to me, and you know what? I don't give a damn. Evidence doesn't matter, because I know what I know. Either way, the individual marches forth proudly, intoxicated by their sense of certainty. America in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has elevated this individual phenomenon to the societal level through an exponentially increasing abundance of media that process information to conform to predetermined perspectives, as well as through the atomization of social media and the increased efficiency of customized news feeds. Whether customized by the user or by an invisible algorithm is immaterial. The more contrasting accounts you read about, say, why Hillary Clinton lost the election, the more certain you become that your interpretation is the right one, and more importantly, that the worldview that interpretation supports is also correct. This is why I mentioned a postmodern world. In today's society, we are bombarded with information, with conflicting accounts of just about everything. But rather than splintering and ultimately dissolving our belief in a single, coherent, objectively verifiable truth, the onslaught burns away our uncertainty, cleansing us of any doubt. We are convinced that, in the midst of the tumult, we alone are the steadfast and courageous defenders of integrity and truth. We rise like John Rambo in the climactic battle scene of Rambo 3, a formerly tortured soldier who, after defeating an army of Afghan militants almost single-handedly, emerges from his tank the lean, triumphant, unambiguous apotheosis of his potential. The crucible of battle, rather than destroying Rambo, clarifies and elevates him, eliminating any doubt in the viewer's minds about what they are seeing. A true American hero. And that, I think, is how we all now view ourselves. As heroic in our certainty, our clarity, our superiority to our fellow passengers who are intellectually and morally disingenuous for failing to see things the way we do. We are all Rambo. God bless us, and God help us. This episode was written and produced by me, with music by my brother Mike. You can subscribe to Quite Useless on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and YouTube, and find episodes and extras on the website, thisisquiteuseless.com. If you have a moment to drop us a rating or a review on iTunes, you will be my hero. In case you didn't catch the title, this is the second part of a doubleheader along with Heroes Part 1, What Dies Hardest. If you haven't listened to that one yet, go back and check it out. It's cool. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more action-packed, quite useless adventures.